like to thank everybody for joining us. I'm Greg Murray, the Director of Life Planning at Vistamar School in El Segundo, California, and the Chair of the Data Trends and Analytics Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you to our second webinar of the year, Hoping and Coping, examining the interconnectedness of college counseling, identity, and well-being. At this time, I'd like to invite Sandra Sohne-Johnston, Director of College Counseling for St. Anne's Belfield in Virginia, and a member of the DTA committee, to introduce our wonderful panelists. And I'd also like to shout out our guests from Syracuse, who will be the host of our Access Summer Institute, and are likely to share some great information with us again today. Sandra?
Good afternoon, everyone. What a delight to be here with you. I know how much is going on in all of our lives this week, and I think it's more important than ever to come together to center student wellness. I'm delighted to be joined once again today by Dr. Corey Wallach, who is the Associate Vice President for Student Health and Wellness at Syracuse University. In this capacity, Dr. Wallach oversees the integrated offices of counseling, health promotion, and recreation. Prior to this role, Dr. Wallach served as the Director of Counseling at Syracuse University for 10 years. He received his master's and PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Florida and a BA in psychology from the University of Virginia. Our next panelist, Rebecca Heller, is currently the Director of Student Wellness, TK through 12 at Viewpoint School in Calabasas, California. Formerly, she served as the Senior Associate Director of College Counseling at Viewpoint for 12 years before transitioning to this new role, where she focuses on preventative wellness and programming. She is currently working towards her doctorate in education from ASU's Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, where she is looking at mindfulness as a coping skill for the rising rates of anxiety and depression in students from high-achieving schools. A certified yoga instructor who teaches yoga at the school, she is focused on the mind-body connection and comprehensive well-being. Our final panelist is Jamon Pulliam, Associate Director of College Counseling, who also joins us from Viewpoint School, where he teaches 9th grade human development, advises the Black Student Union, and leads a STEP team. Jamon served as Associate Director of College Counseling at Drew School in San Francisco and an admissions representative at Morehouse College. He has spent the past few summers working as an admissions coach at USC Brevard Scholars, a program for low-income, high-achieving students. He is a proud HBCU graduate by way of Tuskegee University, where he received his degree in psychology and is currently working on his doctorate in educational leadership at UCLA. As a reminder to our audience, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Access member website following our presentation. We'll begin our webinar by hearing from each of our panelists, but we will try to be sure to save a little bit of time at the end of our session to address questions from members. Please make sure you use the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your screen. Enter in your questions and we will get to them as soon as we are able. So let's get started. If you are a part of Access last year and you are in the counseling field, you may have joined us for our first webinar, which was called Centering Wellness, Supporting Student to and Through the Transition to College. And this is part 2. What has happened since we gathered together in 2021? We were at the height of the pandemic and things have shifted. How has that impacted our students? What is our role? How do we come together as a community to continue to support students so that we can move from hoping and coping to thriving and belonging? So without further ado, I want to actually start by turning things over to Rebecca, who is going to lead us through a mindfulness moment so that we can practice what we're talking about.
Thank you, Sandra. So I've had the pleasure of visiting our TK through fifth grade over the past month and just talking with them about big feelings and how to get calm and center ourselves. And so an activity that I show them, which we'll do together today, is the trace your hand breathing. So everybody put up one hand, and then you're going to use your finger on the other hand, and we're going to trace our hand while we breathe into our bellies. In through our nose and out through our nose if that's available to you, or in through your nose, out through your mouth, or through your mouth, whatever's working for you. So go ahead and sit up tall, one hand out, place your finger below your thumb, and we'll just inhale up to the tip of our thumb and exhale out. Inhale in, exhale out. Inhale in, exhale out. Inhale in, slow and deep. Exhale out. And inhale in to the tip of the pinky and exhale out. So hopefully that allowed you to center and come into the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Corey, Rebecca, and Javon, thanks again for being a part of this panel. I would like to begin by thinking about where we were, as I said, in January 2021 and where we are now. What have each of you noticed from your perspective as salient changes that you're observing in your day-to-day interaction with students and in your school communities? Let's start with Rebecca and then go to Corey and then go to Jamal.
Yeah, I would say since the last time we spoke, at Viewpoint, we've been working with Sunia Luther's company, Authentic Connections, to do either a high achieving school survey or the resilience survey to measure levels of anxiety and depression among students at our school. And we've been noticing, and it's a national trend, and I'm sure if you've looked at the news or read any of the articles recently, that those levels have just continued to rise. And I would say that we're seeing that here. And it was interesting to me to watch this year as we came back together, which allows for connection and so much relief in terms of, people being together. But we also sort of forgot the lessons we learned from the pandemic of doing less. And so everything came back, whoosh, and so many activities. And on top of that, I think we're doing a lot of wellness programming, which is really exciting, but it's also more, right? And so I feel like while anxiety and depression levels have not lessened. In fact, there was just an article, I think in the Wall Street Journal like 2 days ago about that they're still on the rise, that we're still doing more and more. And some of that's great programming and wellness programming, but there's not a lot of space to process.
Corey, I think it's over to you.
So before I say anything else, let me acknowledge I'm a huge soccer fan, and I am sitting here today at the home of the national champion soccer team. Men's team won yesterday afternoon. So I had to get that out there. Go SU, our first national championship for our men's soccer team. Good, now we can focus on the business at hand. That's our little recruiting plug as well. That's right, SU soccer. Woohoo. All right, so January 21 to today, besides us being the national champions in soccer, what we're really seeing on college campuses, and I will try and represent both Syracuse data, but also the national data from college campuses. Much like what Rebecca was talking about, and for those of you that were with us back in 21 when we did this webinar, on college campuses, we've been watching this trend for the better part of the last 15 years. Depression and anxiety have been going up at a really steady clip. So we've reached the point now that with an incoming class at your average university, when I say average university, large, small, commuter, it does not matter, region of the country. what you're really looking at with an incoming class is you can expect at least a third of the students to be coming in with some prior diagnostic history of depression and or anxiety. 40% of them coming in on some form of psychotropic medications. So we've been watching those trends, for quite some time. Depending on what data points you look at, you can either see that the sky is falling and that our students have absolutely gone off the mental health cliff, if you will. You could also concurrently look at those same data trends, though, and say on a college campus, things have leveled out some. Although we're still seeing a lot of overwhelmed students. Interestingly, COVID, for the most part, did not move our numbers a whole lot. When you really dive down into the collegiate data points, what you'll see is that students who had really high levels of depression and anxiety, or that were really lonely before COVID, they're saying, you know what, I'm a little bit worse now. But students who weren't reporting that, we saw very little change. And I will tell you that I was one of the people who sat in my office in March of 20 and fall of 20 and talked to my leadership here on our campus and said, I'm really worried about the mental health crisis that's going to follow this pandemic. I'm worried about the impact of isolation. I'm worried about the impact on suicidality. I'm worried about the impact on substance use. And it's just, for the most part, again, at individual levels, yes, we've seen some of that, but for the most part, that's just not what's borne out. We can talk a little bit later on, don't need to go too far into the weeds right now, but I think it provokes a really fascinating conversation on resiliency. And when we talk about the resilience of our students and what are we watching, if you look at most media outlets that talk about higher education, the New York Times in particular loves to do a Sunday report on the mental health of college students and how much they're suffering and how poorly college campuses are doing at managing it. It's an interesting media spin, which in some cases may be true. But again, we can break this down a little bit later on as we go through the webinar today. A lot of the data doesn't show that. A lot of the data is actually showing that our students have phenomenal resiliency depending on their identity groups. And then it kind of looks at, what are we talking about over the last 10 and 15 years becomes a slightly different conversation. Yeah, I'll share a little bit more as we go, but I would say the take home message on a college campus, if you look at right now since 2021, I would actually say we're for the most part status quo, and it'll be interesting to see the fall data from right now, because there might even be an argument to be made that as we come out of the pandemic and quote normal returns for some students in some settings, we might actually see some positive outcomes of a renewed sense of belonging and a renewed sense of importance of connecting with other people. Jamon, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Corey. And I was not here a part of the first conversation, but so happy to be here today. And I would just speak from the college counseling perspective. I mean, to put it candidly, based off, some of what Corey has said, I would say students have not been doing well this year. I think there were years that it ebbed and flows, but I think this year there were weeks that through the fall, there were days that would go by that I did not have a student crying in my office, and thinking about how that's amplified by the college process. And I think that there was a huge disconnect, as we see from year to year, between some of the expectations of the students and I think sometimes their parents and, the pressures that they have. They have so much pressure to do well, so much pressure to perform, so much pressure to have these good expectations and make so many people proud. And I think it really impacted them a lot this year. And I think as we kind of came through the pandemic, as we started to get back on our campuses, we saw that some of our students did not have the same social skills that they would if we had been in our classrooms not impacted by the pandemic. And I think that really transposed in different ways. But I think this fall, I saw it a lot that students were not doing well. And when I think about our students of color, they have so many more pressures and so many home responsibilities, and some of them have jobs and, things like that. A lot of that really saw itself in the college process. They have so many pressures. So it was a tough fall this year.
Thank you, panelists. So I want to go a little bit deeper into some of the topics we have covered. Going back to you, Rebecca, thinking about your role in college counseling to your current role, what was the rationale for the move? How has the move helped you serve your students better? And I think with this one, if you can partner with Jamon being on the college counseling side and you being in the counseling side. So what is that partnership? What are some of the concerns you're seeing? And what is the scale and scope of the problem?
So I was working, I've been at Viewpoint, this is my 13th year, and I was working in the college counseling office for many years and just watched the rates of anxiety and depression in the students rise, and was thinking and reading articles, to Corey's point, that were saying, like, students were going to college well prepared academically, but not always so well prepared socially and emotionally. And so really thinking, how can we be preparing and also thinking preventatively about mental health for our students, so that when they got to college, they weren't taking leaves of absences or withdrawing. And so that's how my role here came about, is really starting with our TKers and creating common language and scope and sequence as we think about that sort of preventative programming, and creating coping skills, right, to care for our well-being, because there are, as Jamon was saying, immense pressures on these students, particularly from high achieving schools. In fact, this group is labeled at risk because of the pressures, societal pressures and pressures around the college process on them. So what can we do to get them ready to be well prepared in college, and both here and beyond, right, and throughout the rest of their lives? And so things like the mindfulness exercise we did at the beginning, and things that can help ground them and center themselves when all those feelings and pressures are on them. I think that answered the first part of your question. I'll turn it over to Jamon for a moment to answer some more.
Yeah, I mean, I think knowing that Rebecca was in our office for many years, we know that she can easily wear both hats. So I think, in her last few years in the office, she was really trying to implement more mindfulness in a lot of the stuff that we do. So we really tried to continue that. And we put that into our student programming. When we have class meetings, we're thinking about the mindfulness, we're thinking about reflection. I often have students, I'll pass out note cards and just ask them questions. How are you doing? 3 words to describe how you're feeling today, or allowing them an opportunity to check in with one another or check in with me. And we also implement that in some of our parent programming. When we have parent nights, we will have a slide about mindfulness, or we will have a slide about reflectiveness, and allowing parents to know how students are also receiving the same type of education. So we're putting that in a lot of the stuff that we do day to day, as we see them in small groups and we see them in large class sizes, but also making sure that parent and guardians are also getting those same messages, hoping that after maybe the 6th time they've heard it, it might make a little bit of an impact. So that's really important.
Thank you, Rebecca and Jamon. Corey, you talked a little bit about national data, and different ones of us in our schools see mental health concerns manifest a little differently. But what is the data telling you? What are you observing? You talked again a little bit about trends and what you thought things would look like at the height of the pandemic, where they are now. What are some of the new predictors of success for the 4 years in college? What should be on our radar, given what's on your radar? And since we send the students to you, what should we keep in mind?
Yeah, there's a very rich data source developing in higher education that demonstrates to us the #1 predictor of grade point average, the #1 predictor of 4-year graduation, 5-year graduation, 6-year graduation rates is mental health and well-being. So more specifically, really what that pool of research is showing us is if you took an incoming first-year student and you gave them a depression questionnaire and an anxiety questionnaire and a sleep questionnaire, and you put those 3 measures together and you call it a wellness score. It's an oversimplification in that I'm leaving out exercise, nutrition, and some of the other important pieces of wellness. But if you just looked at sleep, depression, and anxiety, that is a better predictor for you of those graduation rates and grade point average in higher education than high school GPA, high school class rank, SAT score, standardized test score. And we see that across the country right now in higher education, that really that wellness score is your biggest predictor of academic success in higher education. The students, regardless of what their academic performance was in high school, and regardless of the academic background in high school, that those data points hold no matter what variables you kind of measure for and control for. So what we're really, really quickly learning in higher education is that if our students are going to be successful, they're going to have to be well. And I think it's something that we've always kind of nodded our heads at, and we've just, yeah, that makes sense. But I think now if we really, really look at the data, you'll see it bear out in numbers at pretty astonishing rates. Again, I can be a bit of a data wonk, and so not going too far into the weeds on some of this research, but one of the studies that just blows my mind is from 2018, so it's pre-pandemic, but I'm looking forward to it hopefully being replicated here. But that wellness score that I'm talking about, where you're looking at depression, anxiety, and sleep, at the high school, the collegiate level, you're talking about a grade point average that can be as much as a 0.4 or 0.5 GPA points different based on wellness scores. So just practically put into what that means, you're talking about a student who might have a 3.3 in university life, that if their mental health is in a different space, they might be at a 3.7 or 3.8. You're talking about the difference for a high achieving student. You're not talking about the impact on graduate school, law school, medical school, et cetera. The lower end of that is even more concerning to me. That's where we start to see our leave of absence. That's where we see students leaving school and dropping out. Very rarely is it because they can't manage academically. It's almost entirely because there's something else that's really blocking their capacity to operate and function. I think, one last piece I'll say that becomes a little bit complicated to dissect some of that is students who have been on EAP plans when they're in secondary ed. They come to higher ed, and a lot of times they don't want to engage in our accommodations. They don't want to engage with our disability resource services. It becomes a little bit complicated to parcel out where that has impact on academic outcome. So those are some controls and studies that we haven't seen. But regarding identity backgrounds, so racial group, international student status, it all holds the same, that wellness is our biggest predictor of academic success and retention.
Well, thankfully, what we're trying to talk about today is hoping and coping, and hopefully we'll get to a place where we have more information about tools and skills. But Corey, so far, a few folks are asking if you can share information about wellness score. So resources that you can share with us that we can share with our parents. Jamon,
Yeah.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a plethora of various ways of measuring this, right? But in essence, again, if you look at higher education, when you look at these types of studies, they're using measures that are slightly different than those that would use in secondary ed. But really, we're talking about a Beck depression inventory. That's actually the name of a measure. Beck anxiety scale, perceived stress scale. These are all open market. A lot of them are open market. Some of them there's minor fees for. My own school district here, our secondary school district, is going through a wellness assessment with all of our high school students right now. There's a plethora of those at the secondary school level. Really, the goal is what you really want to measure is what's anxiety and depression. I mean, those are your biggest predictors. There's a whole host of other mental health variables, like I said. We can talk about some of the holistic wellness and what that means and resiliency, but anything that you can measure in terms of anxiety and depression, those are your two big takeaways for academic success at the collegiate level, for sure.
Thank you. Jamon, I want to come back to you because earlier you talked about parental pressure, the stress our students are under, and how this is all contributing to feelings of anxiety. How can we as counselors be empowered to help our students cope, recognizing that the pressures they are under are an inherent part of the college process? But how can we ease some of that pressure? What are some of the things that you're doing, and how are you partnering with your parents?
Yeah, so I think the big underlying thing that we always think about and try to remind ourselves is that kids will be okay. We know that. They don't know that. Parents might not know that or believe that, but always reminding ourselves that kids will be okay, right? So I think what's important that we really try to focus on is to, one, of course, meet kids where they are. So there are times that kids will come in and they want to dive right into, can you look at this essay? Let's talk about the list, and, trying to check in, how are you? How are classes going? Always just checking in about the day-to-day. And usually before we can even get to the college stuff, now they're saying, well, this AP is really stressing me out, or this test is really stressing me out, or, this thing happened over the weekend at this party, or, my parents or, my siblings are really bothering me about, so on and so forth. And I think when you have that information and those candid conversations with the students, it's easier to really partner with the parents, and not in a way that you're revealing too much information about those conversations, but also trying to help parents understand the pressures that the students are on. In our parent programming, we always encourage a minimal amount of conversation about the college process, maybe one time at dinner, or maybe just once in the car throughout the week, as opposed to every single opportunity that you have. We always remind parents, this is your last year with them in the house, in the traditional way, if you will, if they decide to go away to a 4-year institution. So enjoying those moments of taking them to school and taking them, to different games or whatever the case may be, and enjoying the time that you have with them in the home, because it won't be the same after this year, and the importance of maintaining the relationship, right? I think it's easy for parents to damage the relationship throughout the senior year and not even know it. So really trying to help them understand that, and partnering and have a conversation with both parties and sit down as a family as needed.
Rebecca, one of the things you talked about when we were getting together to talk about this meeting was about validating students. What does that look like? How do we do it well so that it takes into account all the things that you're talking about, Jamon, and gives them some semblance of control over this process?
Yeah, I think, in that way of being emotional scientists with our students, of understanding how they're feeling and allowing them to feel those feelings, right? And then move through them, as well. So, again, back to working with the littles and up to the bigs, is that all feelings are valid, right? Through this process, whether it's stress or even grief when they get decisions, but then being able to move through it to the other side. And so I think that authentic listening piece, when they come into our office, as whether we're college counselors or working in wellness or school counselors, and allowing them to express themselves, is validating without immediately jumping to problem solving, which I tend to do all the time. And I think as college counselors, that's what we're here for. We're like, okay, let's do this, and that'll work it out. But allowing them a little space just to be heard, and saying, yeah, that must really stink, or allowing them to have those feelings.
So what changes have you actually implemented in the last year? Understanding and recognizing the constraints that we are all facing. What is the one or maybe the 2 or 3 things that you have done in your area of expertise that is helping students move into a space of coping? Jamon, do you want to start with that, actually?
Yes, happy to. I think something that has been really important in our office is we've really tried to implement more programming for underrepresented students. I think we are always sitting around the table. We understand that we are in a very affluent area. There are a lot of resources at this school, and we want to make sure that all students have access to different opportunities. So we've really tried to emphasize more thriving and meeting students where they are, that don't necessarily have the resources as some of more of our affluent families. So, this year we started, we have affinity spaces at the school, but this year we have a first generation affinity space. So we have first generation programming throughout the school year, which has been important, which includes meetings and a first generation lunch, which includes our head of school, who's also first generation. So that has been important, really emphasizing the diversity fly-in programs and really trying to help students apply for those. This year, Viewpoint had its first ever HBCU tour, which was a game changer for our community. I think when a few years ago, we started taking kids down to the Black College Expo, which happens down in downtown Los Angeles, which was great. But we really wanted to help students see firsthand what an HBCU experience could be like for them. I think it's easy to talk about it and give them a few schools to apply to, but Viewpoint supported the College Counseling Office in actually doing an HBCU tour. And we went down to Atlanta and visited some schools there and traveled over to Alabama and saw 3 schools in Alabama as well. And beyond just them seeing HBCUs, seeing the Black students who identified as juniors and seniors, seeing the way they bonded outside of our school community, I mean, it's hard to put in words. And I was on that tour as well as a Black teacher in the middle school. And she, I mean, every day she was just telling me like, this is the best trip I've ever seen, I've ever been on. But again, it was great for them to see the colleges, and that's what we were there for. But just, I think it's easy for them to be siloed when they're here in this community, and easy for them to camouflage in different ways into their different, sports groups or, organizations and clubs. And, to see them all in one space and really bond outside of our school community, it was really, really great. So we've really tried to implement different programs for our underrepresented students to, help them beyond the Viewpoint community.
And I will add that in my school, one of the things we did for the first time in May of 2022 was a week-long college application boot camp for all juniors. We divided the juniors into cohorts, and they were able to spend an entire week with their college counseling person assigned to them, as well as members of our humanities department. And for the first time this year, our seniors came with essay drafts, with partially completed common applications. For the first time since I've been at St. Anne's Belfield, I arrived in 2015, this office became a hub for students. They're comfortable here, they're on the couches, and they're students from almost all demographics in our school community. They took responsibility for their college process. There's still anxiety, but the level of engagement really shifted when we spread the process out over a series of months, rather than cramming it into that September, October, November small timetable. So that was one of the things that we did that made a noticeable difference. And I can't imagine proceeding into another school year without something like this, because of how markedly different the level of stress is, and how much better the level of engagement is among our students. So I encourage all of us on the call, given your school community, given what you're seeing, to test things out, see if they make a difference, and see what we can do to bring stress down, so that students aren't so focused on the anxiety surrounding the process, but are much more focused on the things that they can control. Corey, let me actually come to you, and then Rebecca, I want to come back to you to talk about the health checklist that you offer your students. But Corey, what advice do you have for us as we work with students and we think about our programs? What skills should we be reinforcing and helping develop, so that when they arrive on your college campus, they sleep better? If they are struggling with anxiety and depression, they know where to go to help for, and how they can minimize the risk factors and focus more on the things that will help them thrive and belong.
Gosh, I wish that there was about 5 or 6 hours to answer that question. Probably not a simple one. So let me just spitball a couple of ideas. And I'll also say I've seen the requests in the Q&A for some of the research citations. I started to try and open those up on a PowerPoint slide that I have, and then it just became too hard to manage multiple screens and still listen to the conversation. So I will get those links out to all of you, I promise. So the question, what can you all do to help prepare the students? I'm going to take a little twist to your question, Sandra, and make it really specifically about what can you do to prepare them to be emotionally and wellness ready for campus, because academically you're already doing it. That is not the concern point for the students that are coming out of your schools. I love what Rebecca is talking about in terms of mindfulness, meditative practices, yoga practices. Those are so research supported in terms of the advocacy for this age student group in terms of being able to manage stress and anxiety. We talk so much about resiliency, and it's a little bit of an abstract comment that I think that a lot of people don't fully grasp what goes into resiliency. Which really at its core is being able to engage in emotional regulation, being able to experience gratitude, being able to focus on a future instead of getting stuck in the moment of right now while things are bad. I think those are critical skill sets that we talk about, and that we're really trying to engage in. Across higher ed, you're seeing this sweep towards resiliency training and resiliency skill building in our first semester as part of our core freshman curriculum or first year curriculum. And I think that part of that is because there are measurable declines that we've seen from students in terms of their ability to cope with stress. There's different ways that you can measure that, and it is definitely not as strong, generally speaking, amongst our higher ed entering student populations as it was 15 years ago. What I think becomes really difficult, though, in answering your question, and I'll try not to talk for 25 minutes here. I think what becomes really difficult in answering that question is that how do we parcel out what's the environment around the student versus what's the student's individual skills that we need to be able to teach them on, right? So like when we talk about students from different marginalized identity groups, talk about our students of color, we can teach them resiliency skills all we want, but if you're subjected to experiences of racism day in and day out, it is going to take its toll on you. If you identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community and you experience heterosexism constantly, at the legislative level, look at the amount of anti-trans laws that we see across our country. I can teach resiliency skills all day long, but at some point we're going to have to look at the systems that are creating all these mental health problems to begin with. The last thing that I would kind of speak to that and really kind of parcel it down to the transition of secondary to higher ed. Higher ed isn't getting any cheaper. And I saw someone put a comment in about concerns about, will students be able to graduate and be able to have financial success? What's the cost of sending a student into higher ed? What was the cost of going through secondary education? At some point, again, these aren't solutions to the question at hand of what skills do we build, but perhaps the conversations to have with our students is, as I'm making my decision about higher ed, at what point do I take into account my future debt situation? Knowing that the more debt I'm going to take on in my 4 years of higher ed, the more stress I'm going to have and the more anxiety that I have. Maybe I need to think twice about what school I'm looking at, not because I'm not academically capable, but because what's my lifestyle that I want to live. I think that in terms of wellness, sorry, I'll just say one or two more things here and I'll stop. In terms of wellness, I think we really have to go to the individual level and really think about what does someone's own wellness model look like. And by that, I mean, am I somebody who needs to be around nature? Am I somebody who needs to have private space? Those are decisions that I think a lot of times we don't take into account when we're thinking about what institution of higher ed to attend. But if I'm someone who needs to be around nature, probably NYU is not the school for me. Probably the schools in the city of Boston, MIT, Harvard, like these might be the schools I'm supposed to go to. But if those are the places and spaces that ground me and I choose urban living, there's a total disconnect there. And so I think we really, really need to dive down at the individual level to understand what's important to me. I love that Jaman was taking students on tours of the HBUs, right? Fantastic. Is that something that I need? Let's be honest, when we talk about so much of higher ed, we're talking about PWI, right? Predominantly white institutes. What does that mean for a student? What does that mean in terms of their sense of belonging? If we really, really want to dig down into the conversation about resiliency, we're going to have to dig down into an individual's drive and motivation. As much as we try a one size fits all, here's the skill set you need. That's well and good, but it's probably only 30 or 40% of our equation. Probably the 50 or 60% of our equation is who's the individual at play here, what are their values and what are their unique needs, and let's try and match that up to the school rather than going into the US News and World Report. Here's the top 5 schools, I better go to one of these.
One of the questions that has come up is, can you share examples of mindfulness or reflection activities that can be incorporated into college counseling meetings? So Rebecca, thinking about what Corey has just said, and thinking about this question, thinking about your health checklist, do you have recommendations of the kinds of practices that we can infuse into our day-to-day programs, for students, for parents, that might begin to get to putting students in a space where they can have a more honest assessment of their individual needs?
Yeah, ooh, that's a great question. I want to start by saying that wellness and well-being are unique to every single person. So mindfulness and mindfulness is made up of many different things. Because I think I'm a yoga teacher and because it works for me, I tend to go to breath work, but that's not going to work for every person and every body. There's a lot of other different skills that we can teach. But I think whatever we can do, and we're working with high school students, so they're going to roll up their eyes at us a lot, right? And so, and I like to think like, well, but maybe I'm teaching them a skill that one day they'll go, oh, yeah, that really does work. So I would say, even in the moment, if you're not getting the response you're hoping for, maybe you're planting a seed. At least I think of it that way, so that I don't get too discouraged sometimes. But I would say anything that's going to help them self-reflect, particularly in this process, to Corey's point about thinking about where you really want to be. And it's getting past the ego, right? It's getting past the name brand school. It's getting past what do my parents want, but what do I authentically want? And however we can get there, and we can almost always only get there in stillness. There's a saying that ships only come into calm waters. And so we have to be able to bring ourselves to a level where we are able to sense in literally to what we want. And so there are many, many activities that can do that, and they're all not right for every person. And so, but I'm happy to share any that I know with anyone who's interested.
I think what certainly can help us all as we reflect on the information we're sharing today is Corey, when you find the documents and you can share them with us, perhaps if we can go to our school communities with information about the wellness score, if we can frame our conversation about wellness and mindfulness and resiliency in both the framework of what's happening in the national context, but at a more individual level, what we can do as independent school communities and as college counseling offices to begin to equip students to move beyond our college campuses and thrive in all of these amazing colleges and universities around the country. Certainly, as Rebecca, if you can also share information, that would also be wonderful. But Jamon, looks like you had a thought or a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the question about the exercises or mindfulness in the college counseling meetings. And I think an ode to Rebecca, in mostly all of our slides, whatever PowerPoint we're doing, we have some type of mindfulness slide. And it's usually some type of GIF or some type of exercise where it might be breathing. Something that I like to do, similarly to what you said, Sandra, our college counseling boot camp, at the start of every day, I had a note card and I just asked them questions, just general questions, to really try to get them in a more free space in their head before we really kind of took a deep dive into the business. So what's your favorite ice cream? Who's your favorite superhero? 3 words to describe how you're feeling. Maybe what's your goal for the week? Maybe what was your highlight of last night? Whatever the case may be, just some free form questions to really kind of get the juices flowing, if you will. And I would say, just a shameless plug for the college counselors, some of that I used in the letters of recommendation later. So I had those notes cards that I might reference back based on some of the responses that they gave me. And even when we have large class meetings, it's the same thing. I'm like the king of icebreakers in our office. So I like to do a lot of icebreakers in meetings. Again, very low stakes activities that allow them to just kind of be free before we get into, oh my gosh, the college stuff. We're talking about college almost at every grade level, and it becomes a lot of more pressure every single year. So I like to do a lot of little activities or icebreakers or reflections In my 9th grade, I teach human development, which is unique at Viewpoint, but I do a lot of journaling. And even for this year's senior class, some of them I had as freshmen. And in some of our college counseling meetings, I pulled out their journals when they were stuck on an essay. I'm like, remember when you said this when you were in 9th grade? And they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. So really allowing them to just reflect in a way that they likely wouldn't do otherwise.
So we, I think, have to wrap this up so we can open the conversation to our fellow college counselors. But a few quick things. One, Rebecca, just a quick reminder, don't forget to talk about the health checklist. And I don't know if you can share it in the space so that our participants can see it and access it. That's one. And second, the question for all of the panelists, one of two things. Either if you had a magic wand, what is one skill you would want students to have? Or what does coping look like in our programs and on our campuses? So magic wand, what skill? Or what does coping look like in these high achieving schools where students are at risk?
Yeah, none of us want to take any of those two questions. They're too big. So the magic wand skill that I would love to see our students have, gosh, I sat here and I thought about a bunch of different ones when you asked that question, but really I think at the end of the day, for me to be vulnerable communication. A real ability to be able to be maybe authentic is a better word than vulnerable, but I kind of put those two together. To really be able to authentically communicate what their concerns are and what their needs are. And I recognize I say this from my background being as a psychologist, right? That I think what we really see, and this probably translates into the second question of the coping part. My biggest concern, one of my biggest concerns as a therapist, when I used to be a therapist with our students at Syracuse, was that they would get to year 3, maybe even year 4 of their Syracuse journey and realize, I don't want to do any of what I'm doing. And I've been doing it for all the wrong reasons. And I was chasing after, we obviously have a very big Newhouse communications program. I was chasing after the dream of going into LA or New York City and being a communications star, or I was in the business school because I was going to go become a Fortune 500. And they wake up and they realize I wasn't doing any of this for me. I was doing it for someone else. And the reason that I'm anxious and depressed is because I'm chasing someone else's dream, not mine. And so I think one of the biggest coping skills I would love for our students to have, and maybe it gets back to the magic wand, is I'd love for them to be able to slow down enough to be able to really explore what they want to do and not believe that at age 16, 17, and 18, the path is already determined and they have to follow X path. I think we don't talk about that enough when we talk about anxiety and depression. It's a little bit matrixy in some ways. And I think COVID can actually, when I made the comment about the mental health cliff didn't happen in higher ed, I think in some ways COVID actually forced students to slow down a little bit and question why they do what they do. And we saw this ridiculous move away on our campus, away from students wanting virtual appointments, away from students wanting apps, to students saying, I want to come into the building and sit down with you and be with you in person. So I think there's something from COVID for us to learn that connects into communication, into belonging, and finding real meaning and purpose. So I maybe gave you more than 2 or 3 words, but that would be it.
I love that. I'll speak to it sort of answers your question and sort of talks about the mental health checklist. So I just put it in the chat, but I don't think, Sandra, I don't know if you can send it out to, if it works anyway. So I think my hope for students is that they are in touch with their needs, because I think often at our schools, what I've noticed is that students think, oh, like college is this goal and it's sort of this finite goal. And when I get in there, everything's going to be fine. And that is so far from the truth, right? College is a 4-year experience where you're going to learn and grow and hopefully mature. So to learn what their needs are and learn how to take care of those needs. And so this mental health checklist, which hopefully is being shared, is a way that they can reflect on that and look forward towards their college and finding the resources there, because mental health issues are only going to be exacerbated when they go to college if they're not well managed. You know, they need to have their medications in place. They need to have their, you know, be prepared for crisis beforehand. And so to just be thinking and planning and know how to care for themselves, that would, I guess, be my magic wand.
Yeah, I think Corey brought up a really good one that I think is difficult sometimes, but I would also add to the vulnerability. I think in our role in college counseling, I find that students always want to show us the best version of themselves. It's funny, sometimes you might be in the faculty lounge and you'll hear a teacher saying how awful this kid is. And you're like, well, in our meetings, they're just the sweetest little angel. Like, I'm so surprised to hear that. And I often find that they think that we hold all the cards. Like, you are my college counselor, you know the colleges know you, that rep came in here and they called you by your first name, you all are friends. They think that we hold these cards, and I think it's so easy for them to put a wall up, if you will. And I think that vulnerability is so important. And the conversations that I had, and sometimes that would lead to the tears, were the kids who were able to be vulnerable and be honest and open about whatever was happening right now in their lives, regardless if it had to do with the college process or not. And often the college process is really the surface. And as you dig deeper, you understand this social group thing happened, or something is happening at home, or there's so much pressure around the college process, or as they've been writing the essay, they're not understanding their identity, yet they're trying to talk about it. I mean, there's so much that goes into it. So I think that vulnerability and really trust that we as adults, we are here for them no matter what, right? I think it's very easy for some of our students to not always trust us and trust the adults. So I think that vulnerability is important, but also that trust that we as adults, that we are here and only hoping for their best interests.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, Corey, and Jaman. That was incredibly helpful. So I would like to open this up to questions. I know there have been some questions that have come up in the chat, and one of the things that we will do is follow up with some links and resources from Corey. But the other thing that I hope that we can all do is crowdsource resources. So if in your office you have a mindfulness practice, or you have a way that you're helping parents cope with anxiety, or you have access, Scotty asked a question about information about data on future job prospects. And I know that there's something out there, and I think it's Georgetown University that manages this database that I cannot remember. But if you have access to this information at your fingertips and you can share, we will reach back out to everyone and compile all of these resources that we have crowdsourced so that we can work collaboratively in support of our students. Questions, anything that we can be helpful for. So there is one question. Are there professional growth opportunities for school-based counselors in the areas raised in this powerful webinar? Well, thank you. But resources for professional development. So I can actually share one of the things that we have thought about as a school. The Stanley King has a summer institute that focuses on deep listening. And as counselors, one of the challenges, certainly, and we collect information, but is in really listening. So as a professional growth opportunity, that is one of the places I would suggest, if your school has the resources, to think about a counseling webinar like Stanley King. Other options outside of going to get PhD programs like Rebecca and Jaman.
Which I don't know I recommend in the thick of the fall. I have not done this conference myself, but something that has been on my radar is the Blackberry River Retreat. And I don't know if you've done that, Rebecca, but I know that it's a retreat that's supposed to be remote and introspective and mindful, and it's for independent school college counselors, and I know it happens at Mount Holyoke, and I think it's led by faculty from the Stanley King Institute, but it is something that's been on my radar for a little while now. I haven't been able to do it, so I don't know if you know more about that, Rebecca.
Yeah, I went many years ago, but it's an excellent professional development opportunity and it's for college counselors to be better counselors. So a lot of focus on mindfulness and active listening. That was a great one. Yeah, there's a lot of programs and resources. It sort of depends how wellnessy you want to spin, but I'm thinking of things like Ruler, which is out of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, is a school-based training. I don't know if some of your schools are affiliated with Challenge Success. That's actually a really nice pairing of the college counseling world with wellness and well-being. That's out of Stanford University. There's Making Caring Common out of Harvard University, and many others that maybe are more geared towards counselors. But if I have lots of links and resources, and I'm always getting webinars. So if you're particularly interested in like the wellness aspect, I'd be happy to share.
Just to that last one that Rebecca mentioned, I would just add University of Pennsylvania. They've got a really fabulous train the trainer model that's not designed for any population per se, so it can really be replicated anywhere. But it's a train the trainer model in resiliency. So it's a 5-day on-site training where you get trained in resiliency concepts. And in turn, the expectation is for you to be able to bring those resources back to other communities and train those communities in those skill sets as well. That's out of UPenn.
Great. Greg, it looked like you wanted to share something about professional growth opportunities. Maybe not. We are at
That wasn't me.
Oh, there you are. Yes. Go ahead, Greg.
Oh, that wasn't me.
Nope. All right, never mind. So we are at 1:58, a couple of minutes before we wrap up our webinar. I just want to say thank you to Rebecca, to Corey, to Jamon for taking the time to join us today to reflect on ways in which we can support our students, our parents. But one important thing, Rebecca, I think is even with doing that exercise, thinking of how important it is for us to engage in these wellness activities as we care for young men and women. This is a week where we're going to be receiving a lot of decisions. As I was saying earlier, I'm bracing for impact. And so we also have to be well as we think of making sure that our students are well. Thanks also to Ariel, to Greg, to Linda, and to Emmy for partnering with us as we prepared for this webinar and delivered information to you. Thank you in advance to everybody who is on the call and who will help crowdsource information so that together we can be stronger, we can learn from each other, and we know that we're not alone. Last words from panelists.
I would just say it'll be okay. And I think something that I've had to really learn and teach myself is also to take care of myself through all of this. As Sandra said, there will be some decisions this week, bracing for impact, and I've had to learn ways to cope. And, you know, similar to some of the things Rebecca said, even bracing myself and my posture when I'm sitting in my desk, preparing for what a student might be preparing to tell me. We take on a lot of stuff from our students, and it is very easy for us to hold as well. And we have to take care of ourselves. We cannot feed our students from an empty cup. So definitely take care of yourselves.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and best wishes for the holiday season.